We used to be friends. Why are you doing this, please? I would have never left us a minute like this.
All of us now will burn. Get back to me!
Welcome back to the Nerdy Grail and welcome to another franchise discussion video. Yes, this isn't the first time that I have done a franchise discussion on my channel. I've done a fair few already now, so if you haven't seen those, feel free to check them out. So just to name a couple, I have done a video on the Terrifier franchise so far, because obviously that will expand over time. I've done a video talking about the Sonic the Hedgehog movie franchise, which again, that will expand as it goes along. I've done a video on a video game franchise, doing the Batman Arkham video games, including Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. But more recently, I did a franchise discussion talking about the Helliverse. So, Has-Been Hotel and Hell of a Boss, based on all the new updates we've got. So they're just a few of the franchises that I've discussed over the course of my channel so far. And this one is another brand new one, and probably the strangest one that I've done so far. If you can see the films that I've got in the background, you'll have an idea of what franchise or universe I'm talking about. So we've got Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare, Blood and Honey, 1 and 2. I do have Popeye's Revenge there, just because the universe that I'm talking about today, the same studio made that one. So even though Popeye's Revenge isn't part of that universe, I thought it was relevant because the same studio made them, and they're all these sort of turn your childhood dreams and beloved characters into horrible murderers franchise, pretty much. Yeah, if you haven't figured it out already, the latest franchise video I'm doing is on the Poohniverse, or as it's better known, the Twisted Childhood Universe, which is a bizarre universe that I'm surprised has gone on as long as it has, and actually is going to go even further. It's basically the next MCU, pretty much, but this time I think they're calling it like the TCU, for the Twisted Childhood Universe. So, before I break down some of the films, because I always like to do that with these franchises, I think it's first that we take a little bit of a step back, and I'll just discuss a bit of the background information, discuss how this franchise sort of came to be, and then we'll take it from there and discuss each of the films individually. So, without any further ado, welcome to my next franchise discussion. This time, we're taking a trip down memory lane, but we're going to twist it up a little bit. So welcome to the Twisted Childhood Universe. Okay, so this section of the video is just going to be on like the background and how it came to be and what even is this TCU or Twisted Childhood Universe, because I'm still quite baffled myself. I'm still unsure whether I like it or not. I suppose to a degree I like it because it's just so weird and wacky, but in terms of them as movies, they're a very mixed bag. However, check out my review on both Popeye's Revenge, and in particular, if you're talking about this universe, my review on Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare to hear my thoughts. But you'll finally hear my thoughts on both the Blood and the Honey films in this video as well. So what's it known as? Well, the tagline we have got is the Poohniverse, because towards the end of this so-called phase of the movies, we're going to have a movie title like Poohniverse, Monsters Assemble, a bit like Avengers Assemble, where all the monsters are going to come together and try and team up to take out all the surviving members of their movies. But it's better known as the Twisted Childhood Universe, or the TCU, bit like the MCU or the DCU or the DCEU. You know, we've got all these little different initials for things nowadays. So this is the TCU, the Twisted Childhood Universe, which I think is quite a unique little name, if you ask me personally. So what actually is it? Well, I had to do research, and from what I can gather from the films as well, it seems to be this really weird, twisted, shared continuity of independent movies. They all seem to take the form of like a generic slasher style movie, because there's lots of that and lots of gore in all these movies. But it's basically like a shared continuity of independent slashers that all come together and will meet up at some point, as we already know from the so-called Poohniverse movie that is coming in the far future. What is it based on? Well, Winnie the Pooh, Peter Pan, there is a movie later on this list that we're talking about, Bambi, there's a Pinocchio one coming. Even if you want to talk about there are other projects that aren't in the universe like Popeye, you can get an idea that these are just dark reimaginings of beloved childhood classic characters that have now entered public domain, and people have decided, hey, let's turn these into wild, wacky horror movies and scare the kids or creep out the adults, or just that shock and wow factor, which, if you've watched any of these movies, you will definitely get the shock and wow factor. Trust me on that. So who actually started this? Because I wasn't really sure who started it until I did a little bit of research on it. So this was created, and I'm going to try not butcher any names in this video, so I apologise if I do. So this was created by Rhys Wake Waterfield and was produced by filmmakers Jagged Edge Productions, and you'll see that at the start of all the movies. So that's the company, that's the people, that's the main people who have put these films together. That's who has started it all. And yeah, I must admit, I don't know how you came up with this idea, but it's both genius and insane at the same time. So what is the whole plot, do we want to say, of the universe, really? So like we said, it centers around beloved childhood characters who have basically become murderous monsters, really. As you can see, like in the Blood and Honey movies, Pooh is sort of a rabid creature who just wants revenge on those who have wronged him, such as Christopher Robin. In Peter Pan Neverland Nightmare, Peter is this like drug addict who is kidnapping kids and sending them to Neverland. In the recent trailers and stuff for Bambi The Reckoning, we can see that Bambi has got like really sharp teeth and is out for revenge on those who, I believe I've read in the plot, has supposedly killed obviously Bambi's mother due to a car accident or something. But Bambi seems, you know, really scary and out for blood, if I'm being honest. So that's basically what these sort of are. They turn these cutesy, fragile creatures into something more monstrous and murderous, which is really strange, but also fascinating at the same time. So how is it really? Well, Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey was the first one, which, you know, now watching Blood and Honey 2, there's a vast night and day difference between the two of them, which Blood and Honey was actually met with not very good reviews by the critics, and were we really surprised at that, to be perfectly honest? Because obviously at the time it wasn't put together the best, it was very low budget, you know, and yeah, it did feel a bit rushed and didn't make much sense, but I still found it quite enjoyable, to be perfectly honest. If I was to rate Blood and Honey, I'd probably say it was a 6. It was fairly enjoyable for what it was. It wasn't great, but it was alright. But then from the audience, it got quite mixed responses. Some people loved it, some people hated it, some people thought it was mediocre, and I'm probably in the mediocre category. I'd say it wasn't awful, but it wasn't anything good by any shape of the imagination. But surprisingly, it made a vast amount of money. Like, I think it had like a budget of, I believe it was like $100,000, and it ended up making like over $7 million at the box office. So it made a very big profit. And so as a result, obviously Waterfield decided, yeah, we've got something here. So I'm going to now try and raise the standards going forward, and we're going to continue this universe going forward. And so they did. That's why we've got so many movies already out and more movies on the way. So in terms of the last section of this background, I want to just quickly talk about because they are doing it in phases. And if you look it up online, you can see that they've got a whole plan, a bit like the MCU does. So their phase 1 started with Blood and Honey 1 in 2023. Then in 2024, we had Blood and Honey 2. Then this year we have multiple, actually. At the start we had Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare. Then we've got Bambi The Reckoning in a couple of months. And then I believe to end the year, stroke start of next year, they're planning on getting the Pinocchio Unstrung movie out. And then obviously it's going to finalise with this Poohniverse Monsters Assembled film, which is actually, so that means there's 6 movies in Phase 1, a bit like how in the MCU there was also 6 movies in Phase 1 with Iron Man, The Incredible Hulk, Captain America, Thor, Iron Man 2 and Avengers Assembled. 6 movies, so they are literally copying the MCU here, but that's fine, and they're doing it in their own weird and wacky way. And all the movies are unique. Which, speaking of the movies, I think it's time now that we've had a little bit of a background talk. Let's start jumping into these movies, and I can give you my deeper thoughts. Maybe I can rate them, tell you whether I recommend them or not, and then we can proceed as we go. So, what's the first movie on this list? Well, we need to go all the way back to 2023, when we had the first trailers and first look at Winnie the Pooh in a new monstrous way in Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. Okay, so first on the list is Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. And yeah, this is a very interesting film to look back on now that we've got a few more movies within this TCU or the Poohniverse or whatever you want to call it. It is a very unique one. And this over here in the UK came out on the 10th of March 2023. And yeah, it did have a budget of around $100,000 and made approximately 7.7 million. So it did make a profit and it did do really well considering that budget. The budget is apparent in the movie because the way that the characters look, the acting, the set choices, it's all a little bit ropey and early doors. But to be fair, since that film, we have seen a good, or at least a decent bit of progression. So I can sort of forgive it here and there. And considering it was the first of its kind, I think it does okay. But yeah, as you could probably even see, or you can see on the images that I'll put on the screen, the costume for both Pooh and Piglet are really, really silly. They look like if you went into a Halloween costume store and you found like a rubber bear mask. That's sort of the kind of thing you're looking at. And then this lumberjack looking costume. It's mad, it's mental, and does look very like just slapped together, kind of looking like Pooh to a degree because of the red and the blue lumberjack looking outfit, you know, sort of going with Winnie the Pooh's red top that Pooh usually wears. Obviously they didn't go the full hog of him only wearing a t-shirt. They couldn't do that in this movie. But what is the sort of plot of this movie? Well, when I go into Blood and Honey 2, I will sort of go back over Blood and Honey 1 a little bit because there are some contradictions and some lore changes that, you know, will make this part a little bit irrelevant, but it's still worth mentioning. So in this film, Pooh and Piglet and all the others in, you know, the 100 Acre Wood, you know, they mention Eeyore, Rabbit, Owl, and Tigger, but you don't see any of those in the movie. It's only Pooh and Piglet in this movie. Basically, they were, like you see with Winnie the Pooh, friends with Christopher Robin, who used to come and feed them and look after them. They play games, and then eventually he went off to college, left them, and so they eventually starved because they didn't have Christopher helping them out, and so they started having to fend for themselves, and they say that they had to resort to eating each other, so they ended up killing and eating Eeyore, and so that drove them insane, and so then they wanted revenge on Christopher Robin for abandoning them. And that is literally the plot of the movie. Pooh and Piglet trying to get revenge on Christopher Robin for abandoning them, but then there's this other plot line thrown in of these girls who have gone away to stay at a nearby house in the 100 Acre Wood, and then they get tangled up in everything that's going on with Pooh and Piglet and Christopher Robin. Because Christopher Robin does get captured at the start of this movie and is being held captive by Pooh for the characters who've arrived at the cabin to eventually find and rescue him. So it's a basic premise, and it is a fairly basic movie. But, you know, it's an interesting one to start with. The gore it's believable, but also it's still got that cheap look to it where it doesn't quite disgust you, but it disgusts you just enough. There's some very weird choices and some very weird things that go on in this movie. But even though I'd said about the costume before looking very silly, I must admit it actually looks quite terrifying because of like the uncanniness of it and how there's not much expression to it. Like, you'll see Pooh, he'll just be like smiling the whole time, or if he's angry, he'll just be angry for the whole scene that he's angry. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of movement in the mask itself. But that actually makes it more scary if you see him, like, because there's a scene where he's chasing one of the girls down whose car's broken down, and she notices Pooh in the distance, and he's just staring deadpan at her with a smile on his face, and then he just starts sprinting towards her, and it looks terrifying. A lot more terrifying than what it does in Blood and Honey 2, but that's because they tried to make it a bit more realistic with a better budget, and it looks fantastic, but obviously it's less creepy for me for some reason. And Piglet gets killed in this movie, so I'm kind of like, oh, okay, so we're not going to see Pooh again in this universe, but... not Pooh, Piglet again in this universe, but yeah, who knows. And also, if you're expecting Winnie the Pooh to talk, Winnie the Pooh does not talk in this movie very much. He does say, like, 2 words in the whole movie, right towards the end, before he's about to kill Christopher Robin. He says, "You left." And that is the only thing that Pooh says for the whole movie. The entire movie. So if you're expecting Pooh to talk, you're going to be a bit disappointed in this movie. So what would I rate this movie out of 10? Well, I did say earlier I'd probably give it a 6. And yeah, it would kind of flutter between a 5.5 and a 6 out of 10. It's nothing special. It's okay. I can sit down and watch. I've watched it twice now. But it's not one that I'd rush to rewatch. But it was an okay start to the franchise, you know. And it was an interesting experiment, and we didn't know if it would work. And clearly, they're doing something. Maybe it's just our weird fascination for seeing these childhood classics that's boosting it up. I don't know. But a year later, we did get then the release of the next movie in this franchise. So sit back, relax, grab another jar of honey, because we're going to delve into the 100 Acre Woods again, starting with Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey 2. So you remember how I just said in Blood and Honey 1 that Blood and Honey 2 was going to make Blood and Honey 1 practically irrelevant in this universe? Well, yeah, that kind of does happen. So, okay, so Blood and Honey 2 was just as good as Blood and Honey 1. You know, it had a little bit more of a budget this time going around. And it made more or less the same amount of money. It made around 7.6 million, I think. So like 7.5 million roughly. So it's still going strong, and people were still fascinated in seeing these movies. But obviously they had a bigger budget to work with, so they were able to change the designs of the characters. They were able to then explore and expand the universe more by introducing new characters that they'd hinted at in the previous movie. So like in the previous movie, Pooh and Piglet were the only 2 characters in it from the Winnie the Pooh classic characters. This time they added in a couple more. So this time we have the introduction of Owl and Tigger as well. And I know a lot of people were excited for that, and I was intrigued to see how they'd incorporate those. But also they brought Piglet back to life, which I know in the trailers confused people, but in the movie they explain exactly why Piglet's there. And that is because, I don't know whether they did it just so that they can say, oh, don't worry about the first movie. It may look cheap and weird, but there's a reason for that. You know, it's because the events of the first movie now is actually a movie in universe that people are using to mock Christopher Robin about. So technically the events of the movie happened, but not in the way that we saw them. That was like a movie basically over-exaggerating and taking the mick out of the actual events, if you get what I mean. So yeah, so technically Blood and Honey 1 happened, but also didn't happen. And so for that reason, they decided to then implement a new plotline and a new bit of lore to Pooh. So this time, rather than Winnie the Pooh just being this creature that is just out in the woods that Christopher Robin found and so happened to be feeding and playing with, it turns out that actually all of them, so Pooh, Piglet, Owl, Tigger, they are actually children that got kidnapped and taken away and experimented on and became mutated animal creatures. Yeah, that's basically what they are. They're old kids who have now been mutated and changed to look like these characters that we know and love. But they also seem to imply, well, not imply, they practically tell us that Winnie the Pooh is Christopher Robin's brother. A brother who got kidnapped one day and never was seen again, but it turns out it was Pooh, and that's why Pooh has such a hatred of Christopher, because he almost blames him for being kidnapped and what happened to him. Very bizarre, very weird, twisted, if you like the Twisted Childhood universe. It's interesting to expand the lore a little bit, but it also just makes it a bit like, I'm not too sure. It's a bit weird. But in this movie, we do have Christopher Robin, who's played by a different person, because everyone's played by different people here, because it's another way of separating it from the first movie and making it out like, oh, those were the actors playing me, but this is the actual me. So you've got new people playing Christopher Robin and Pooh, and they changed up the costumes, like I said. It looks a lot more realistic. But then that also makes it less scary for some reason for me. It didn't blend well with me. I like the characters that they introduced. Like Owl was this really sinister, manipulative, creepy, almost like wise, ancient person who was like almost like a fortune teller telling Pooh what he needs to do, and almost like he's the leader over Pooh. And then you got Tigger, who's this crazy, almost sex pervert-y character who they keep locked in a cage because he's so wild, and they just let him loose towards the end at this like night rave party, and he does some awful things. But yeah, they're interesting characters, and I believe they're planning on doing a Tigger solo movie in the future as well. So yeah, the new characters they introduced were all right. So it expanded the lore more. And I will be interested to see what happens going forward. Pooh does get killed at the end of this movie, but in a post-credit scene, we see that he actually starts to get resurrected. So we knew he wasn't going to stay gone. Again, if you're here to see characters talk, you'll be a little bit more impressed this time round. Pooh still barely says anything. He only, again, says 2 words. But it's like it's a Winnie the Pooh catchphrase this time, because his final words is, "Oh, bother." So he does say something that's Winnie the Pooh related. But if you do want to see these characters talk, you will get that from the others. Owl talks a lot. Piglet comes back because obviously that was just a movie. This is the real thing. And Piglet says 1 or 2 lines this time. Tigger says a decent bit as well. So if you want to see these characters talk, you've got that in abundance, just not with Pooh. So hopefully in the next movie, Pooh might talk a lot more. It would be nice, you know. But yeah, what would I rate then Blood and Honey Part 2? Well, Blood and Honey 1, like I said, like a 5.5 or a 6. I enjoyed Blood and Honey 2 a little bit more, so I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10, if I'm being honest. That might be me being too generous, but I actually quite enjoyed it, to be fair, so I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. But now we're going to take a step away from Winnie the Pooh, because they decided to introduce us to another character who supposedly is going to be one of the most twisted characters in this universe. I have done a review on this movie already, but I am going to give you my thoughts again on it here. I am of course talking about Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare, and obviously I'm going to be talking about the character of Peter Pan. So sit back and let's fly off to Neverland. Well, maybe not this Neverland, but let's go to Neverland and meet Peter Pan. Oh, Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare. I mean, like I said, if you've watched my review on this already, you already know my thoughts about how I think it's one of the most twisted, dark, and sinister so far, in my opinion, of all the TCU, you know. Because they did say that Peter Pan is supposed to be one of the darkest ones, and I know they said there's 2 other characters who we are yet to properly see who are supposed to be quite dark as well, but we won't mention them yet because that's later on down the line. I will obviously do a part 2 of the TCU when more films come out, so count this as like part 1 of the TCU. But yeah, Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare, you do get the typical characters from Peter Pan. You get Peter Pan, Tinkerbell, Michael, John, Wendy, Captain Hook. They are all in it. You know, like I said, the film starts with like this cold open where you get a sort of feel of the movie. You get to see Peter kidnap a child who turns out to be Captain Hook by the end, and see the sort of gore level that we're talking here. It's practically Terrifier levels of gore. You get to see how Peter's face gets mutilated because he wears a mask through most of it, which is what he uses to hide his true persona, because whenever he's wearing the mask, he's quite like a child, you know, quite high-pitched in the way he talks. Tries to be friendly, even though it's really creepy. And then when he takes the mask off, you see his face after the attack that the mother gave him trying to defend her child, who he eventually kidnapped. He goes all dark and sinister, and his voice changes and aggressive, and he's, yeah, very commanding. So the actor does a fantastic job at that, might I add. And it's quite interesting, all the characters of Michael, John, and Wendy, because the core premise of the movie after then going forward is obviously you're introduced to our main 3 characters that we know from the original Peter Pan and stuff, and Michael gets kidnapped by Peter and it's up to Wendy to try and save him. You don't really see John much in the movie, to be honest, but it's quite nice that Wendy in this movie is portrayed as a very loving sister who really cares deeply for her brother, which in this sort of type of movie, and usually in horror movies and especially in lower budget franchises like this, they try to make out the characters as quite mean and horrible. So I was expecting Wendy to not really care and be forced to have to save him, but she does it on her own accord. So it was a really nice and fresh change of pace, to be perfectly honest. You know, the other characters like Tinkerbell being apparently an old victim, an old child that Peter had kidnapped and then sort of manipulated into thinking that no one cared about him and turned him into Tinkerbell. Yeah, Tinkerbell is a middle-aged man in a dress who, her pixie dust that she spreads to make Peter fly and stuff is heroin. Yeah, so there's a heavy use of drugs in this movie. It is really, really bizarre. And we obviously do, like I said, we find out later about Captain Hook, because the child at the start that gets kidnapped is actually, we find out his name was James Hook, and we find out that he was chained in the basement and he's been mutilated over time, because I think I can't remember exactly, I think it was like 14 years. They do like a 14-year time skip after the cold open. But yeah, so yeah, it was interesting. Like I said, if you want my full thoughts on Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare, then go back and check out my review on it. So I'm only going to give a bit more of a briefer one here. But yeah, if I was to give Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare a rating out of 10, I'd maybe give it maybe a 6 or a 6.5. I still think Blood and Honey is my favourite, but I can't deny there was something a bit refreshing in a really weird way about Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare, even though these films are sick. They are sick. Not like the good sick, like the, oh my goodness, I can't believe what I've just watched. But I think that's why, that's why they're being so successful. But yeah, so I'd say maybe like a 6 or a 6.5. So better than Blood and Honey 1, but not as good as Blood and Honey 2, at least in my opinion anyway. But moving then on, we've got one more film that we are going to be discussing in this franchise before I do a little bit of a summary. What film is that? Well, we've talked about Winnie the Pooh and we have talked about Peter Pan. However, there is one more character that is being introduced at the moment currently in the franchise. And that is good old Bambi. The cute little deer. What could possibly go wrong with Bambi? Well, turns out a lot is going on with Bambi. So stay tuned before we talk about Bambi The Reckoning. Alright, so the final movie that I'm going to talk about in this current TCU franchise is Bambi The Reckoning. Now, when I say I'm going to talk about Bambi The Reckoning, I'm going to basically give like a brief idea of the plot and just my overall thoughts into what I think it's going to be like. Because this film actually hasn't been released at the time of recording this, because this film is due out later this year on the 25th of July 2025. So we'll wait and see what actually happens when it comes out. But we've had a few trailers and we've had a brief look at the premise. So that's sort of what I'm going to be discussing here, because it just looks as bizarre as the others. But if I'm being honest, based on the trailers, it actually almost looks like we're going back in terms of cheapness, if I'm being honest. Like, don't get me wrong, Bambi looks cool, but there's just something off about the trailers when I've watched them that makes me think it's going to be Blood and Honey 1 levels again. I don't know why, and I'm hoping I'm wrong. It just feels like we've taken a step back. So obviously this is Bambi The Reckoning, so obviously taking off the plot of Bambi, but changing it to make it weird, wacky, twisted, sinister, turn Bambi into this murderous creature. If you've seen the design of Bambi, which I'll have shown you clips and I'll show images of Bambi, Bambi looks actually really scary. But the problem I've got with this one in particular, compared to Winnie the Pooh and Peter Pan, is there's lots of horror movies based on just killer animals. So apart from using the name Bambi, this one feels the least unique, shall we say, of the lot, because at least of these ones you've got the resemblance of the characters, whereas it's just a deer going on a rampage, you know? But the basic premise, and I got the premise here, so basically, and it is exactly what I said it was anyway. So after a mother and son get into a car wreck, so it's going to be like obviously an accident of sorts, they soon are hunted by Bambi. Yeah, the titular character Bambi, who is a mutated, which is a theme in these ones. The characters of Winnie the Pooh turned out to be mutated, and Captain Hook is definitely mutated, I think, some way in Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare, because he does not look like he should, really. And I don't know how you get to that stage apart from like a mutation. But a mutated, grief-stricken deer who is on a deadly rampage. And if you've seen the trailers, yes, you know Bambi is on a rampage. Chasing cars, flipping cars, breaking through buildings, just going savage. And is seeking revenge for the death of his mother. So yeah, you know, the plot of Bambi, but done if Bambi decided he wanted to take proper revenge on everyone for what happened. So yeah, you've got the elements, which is why they're using it as Bambi, but yeah, it's gonna be a weird one if I'm honest. And like I said, I don't really know what to expect. And the problem is that you know Bambi's probably not going to speak either, because by the looks of trailers, it just looks like it's going to be one of those typical ones where it'll like growl or roar or anything like that. There's not going to be a lot to it, to be perfectly honest, I don't think. So how they're going to make it work? Who's to say? Do I want to give a prediction now of what I might rate it, and then see if I'm wrong when it comes out and I do a review? Yeah, sure, okay. I'm going to predict that I'm going to give Bambi The Reckoning a 5 or a 5.5 out of 10. In my personal opinion, I think it's probably going to be my least favourite. I'm going to give it a 5 or a 5.5. So again, not a terrible movie. Again, mediocre. I don't think any of these movies are terrible because of their uniqueness. I think they are mediocre to not too bad, which is why Blood and Honey 2 I gave a 7. But yeah, so I think 5 or a 5.5 is what I'm going to give Bambi The Reckoning. Yeah, if I'm being perfectly honest. And I'm going to stick by that. But yeah, so that is me talking about Bambi The Reckoning. That is it. That is my discussion so far on the TCU or Twisted Childhood universe. Like I said, this is only the first video on it, because this is only talking about most of the first phase. I am going to do a more updated version of this later on down the line when we get at least another... I would say when we've got at least another 2 or 3 movies out. So maybe I'll do an updated version once the Poohniverse movies come out and I've done an unboxing and review of it. Because then I'll be able to give you my thoughts then on Bambi The Reckoning, Pinocchio Unstrung, and that movie. So then it'll warrant then another video on it, I think. But for now, this is going to be my little review. Well, not little, my slightly drawn out franchise discussion. But I thought it would be interesting to talk about and just see if anyone would be interested in checking these movies out if they haven't decided to already or a bit on the fence. Look, I would say if you like horror movies and you kind of like, obviously, the characters like Winnie the Pooh and stuff like that, I think, just out of like a weird morbid curiosity, I think you should just check them out. Maybe you could make a drinking game out of it or a party game out of it if you're a bit worried that you can't just watch it normally. I think just check it out, personally, because that's sort of the way I've done it. Is, yeah, they weren't going to be my cup of tea, but I thought I'd make a bit of fun out of it. And to be fair, they're alright. They're not great by any means. Don't say that I'm thinking they're amazing movies, but also don't say that I'm saying that they're terrible movies, because I think there's a lot worse movies out there than these, and these have their place, and these are weirdly unique. So check them out when you can, really. But this is going to be the Nerdy Grail signing off for now. I hope you've had an amazing day. Please remember to like and comment your thoughts on the Twisted Childhood universe, and subscribe if you are new. But for now, this is me signing off. I hope you've had an amazing day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye for now, everyone.